name is Yu Zhang, professor at USF. And I'm very happy today because we have a special guest, and I have known her for a long time, since 2002. Since 2002, because we pursued the graduate degrees, master's and PhD together at UC Berkeley. And I think since then we become BBF, and hopefully forever. Yes, so today we have Professor Monica Menendez with us, and she's currently a professor and also Associate Dean for Graduate Affairs in the College of Engineering of New York University, Abu Dhabi. And she's also leading a research center called CITIES. So it's acronym for Center for Interacting Urban Networks. And before that, Monica actually was the director for the research group Transition Engineering at ETH Zurich. And then, as I mentioned, she obtained a master's and PhD degree from UC Berkeley in civil and environmental engineering. And before that, she got dual degrees from University of Miami, which is other side of, another coast of our Florida state. Monica has been really productive researcher, and she has more than 100 journal publications. And also she has done presentation more than 200 times in different conferences and occasions. And then currently she's serving on several editorial board of the top journals in transition field, and also on some advisory board of the very influential transition conference. So I will stop here. You can see more from the flyer that I sent out. And let's just welcome Monica and look forward to a presentation.
Thank you, Yu. Do I really need a microphone? Is it for the people online or? Yes, I need a microphone. Okay, that's okay. I can do a microphone. That's okay. Okay. Thank you. So thank you for hosting me. It has been a long time since my last visit to USF. So I'm very excited to be back in Tampa. I studied in Miami, my undergrad, so this is close to home for me. And before I start the presentation, I'm gonna thank my co-authors, but in particular, Lucas Sambu. He's the common thread across all the different pieces of research that I'm going to be discussing today. In fact, this was his PhD dissertation. He's a former PhD student of mine at my previous institution, ETH Zurich. So today we're going to be talking about urban networks and the capacity of urban networks. Mostly, I don't need to introduce the issue of traffic congestion. I think everyone here is very familiar with it and all the negative externalities associated with traffic congestion. But basically, we have congestion because the demand, how much we want to drive or how much we drive, exceeds the capacity, the supply given by the network. So today we're going to be talking about that side of the equation, the capacity of the network. How do we define it? What is it? How do we get to it? And we're going to be looking at it from multiple perspectives. Now, this picture is of a single link in Abu Dhabi. I live in Abu Dhabi, New York University, the campus there, as I was saying before. And the reason why I'm starting with a single link is because it's easier to introduce the basic concepts at a link level and then expand them to a network. So I'm not sure about the audience because I know there's people online as well. For those of you who are very familiar with traffic theory, please bear with me for a minute or so as I go over basic concepts, because I don't know who else is in the audience and I want to make sure that everyone gets everything that I explain later on. So we all know, hopefully, that at a link level, if we're describing traffic, we typically use three metrics to do so. Flow, the rate at which vehicles are going through the link, so vehicles per hour. Density, how many vehicles I can put in a given space. So if I were to take a picture, how many vehicles would I see per kilometer? So it's vehicles per kilometer. And then speed, how fast we drive kilometers per hour. And we also know that flow is equals density times speed. And this is reflected by something called the fundamental diagram of traffic, which was initially proposed in the 1930s, so almost a century ago by Greenshield. And now we approximate that with a triangle. We understand this is not exact, but it's a good approximation. Every individual link has its own fundamental diagram. And this fundamental diagram describes all traffic states that are possible for that link, and means all possible traffic states are points along this triangle, not above, not below, but along the line, with some scatter because the word is not as deterministic as we would like it to be. So if you're on the left side of the diagram, your speed is rather high and you're in free flow conditions. But if you are on the right side of the diagram, you're in congested conditions. So you basically want to avoid typically going to the right side, which means exceeding the critical density. Now this peak is called the capacity of a link, right? And that's the maximum flow that link can sustain. If you add more density or more cars to a link, then the flow starts decreasing because the speed starts going down and the system is congested. Now, as I said, today it's not about links, but about a whole network. Now, it's not really feasible to describe what's happening at the whole network by looking at the individual links and what's happening at an individual link because it's too complicated. First of all, as I said, the fundamental diagram is specific to each link, which means different links might have different fundamental diagrams. Second, even if two links were to have the same fundamental diagram, there's no guarantee that they're going to achieve the same traffic states at the same time. Meaning one link might achieve capacity at 8 a.m. and the other one might reach capacity at 8:30, right? Moreover, all links are very connected. So we know that the queue from one link can spill back into a link's upstream or block the links downstream, right? So what happens on one side of the network can really influence what's happening on the other side of the network. Fortunately for us, in 2007, 2008, the concept of the macroscopic fundamental diagram was proposed. Now, some people call it network fundamental diagram, which is probably a better name, but I'm sticking to macroscopic because it's the name that is more familiar to me. It's easier for me to say it. So I'm going to be referring to it as the MFD. Now, if you remember, I mentioned the fundamental diagram was initially proposed in the 1930s. It took almost a century for the macroscopic fundamental diagram to prove the existence of the macroscopic fundamental diagram. But the concepts are pretty much the same. Flow equals density times speed, and then you have something that looks like this. Now we know it's flatter, so that approximation with the triangle, we cannot really use it anymore, but other than that, it looks the same. It has certain capacity and some critical density that divide the uncongested states from the congested states. This is the average at the network level. So this is like averaging what's happening in all the links. Now, one requirement is that the network has to be more or less compact and homogeneous, which means I cannot do an MFD for the whole of Florida, probably not even for the whole of Tampa, right? Because there are many different areas on Tampa that behave quite differently, or that might be disconnected because different islands, etc. So you need to have smaller regions than the city. Still, for that region, the MFD, it's a very good approximation of what's happening. And it gives you a very good idea of the traffic states. Sorry. Now, the good thing about the MFD is that it's consistent with traffic physics, and that allows to derive analytical approximations for very simple networks. So those exist already. It's also network specific, the same as the fundamental diagram is link specific. And that means that we can produce elegant macroscopic control strategies or develop elegant macroscopic control strategies. You have probably heard about perimeter control, pricing. There are many pricing schemes that are being developed based on the MFD or other types of multimodal control, etc. And is well-defined and reproducible. Now, here, in fact, you have 28 consecutive MFDs for the morning period in Zurich, Switzerland. That's where I was living before when we started this research, for the month of September 2017. And they all look quite similar. So, which goes to this point of well-defined and reproducible. Now, before I continue, I need to go aside for a second on a side note, I'm sorry, and talk about this reproducibility because I find that it's one of the most common misconceptions for people using the MFD. So first of all, how many people have heard of the MFD before? Everyone? Not everyone. Okay, but many of you. Sorry. So the MFD, when it was proposed by D'Aganzo in 2007, 2008, he said, well, this is completely independent of small changes to the demand. And that's true, because the way that he defined the MFD was, the MFD is the upper bound of all possible traffic states that you can observe in a city. For the sake of this presentation, I'm gonna call that the theoretical MFD. You know, out of all traffic states that I can observe in a city, this is the upper bound. That upper bound, it is invariable, because it's the upper bound of anything that I can observe. Unfortunately, what most people use in reality is the MFD that you observe that you gather from data. And that's not the upper bound, it's something lower than that. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm gonna call it the observed or empirical MFD. This is not invariant. This actually is affected by changes in demand. And I would sort of show you that in a second. But it is important that we understand that what was initially proposed as an upper bound is something very theoretical that assumes that the whole system is used very efficiently. We know reality is different, and the whole system is not used as efficiently. Not all streets are being congested exactly at the same time. Some streets are fuller than other streets. Some streets have more traffic, which lead us to something that's lower. And then you can think of that difference as the inefficiencies of the system, right? These inefficiencies can be driven by many different things. One is interactions with other modes, etc. But it could also be, but it's mostly the way that the demand distributes itself into the network. Anyways, with that in mind, if we start looking at these diagrams, then you might start noticing differences between the individual MFDs. In fact, we use a dynamic time warping algorithm to compare the different MFDs and cluster them. Now, the name sounds very fancy, dynamic time warping. And the only reason why we had to use this algorithm is because we were not only comparing the actual combinations of flow density, not only the actual points, but the temporal aspects of those points. So even two MFDs that have pretty much the same shape, if the system is not getting to the same traffic states at the same time, they might not be grouped in the same cluster. So if an MFD, you get to this point, to this specific combination of flow and density at 12 noon versus another MFD, you get to that point at 9 a.m., those will probably describe different patterns in the city. So we would look at them differently. And this is why we put the time component into it. So now different clusters here represent, different colors represent different clusters. And not surprising, these clusters are sort of repetitive for the demand, or are based on the demand. So these are all Saturdays. That column is all Saturdays. And it happens that all Saturdays this September belong to the same cluster. They're all red. The same is true for Sunday, which is this mustard color. I don't know, this color here, except for this Sunday, which is a weird Sunday. And it's even weirder because it precedes a weird Monday. Right? Now, this happened. It just happens that this Monday is a very unique holiday in Zurich where everyone goes target shooting. So it's very unique. You don't go to school. Kids don't go to school. They go shooting, target shooting. So it's an interesting day. And what means that, you know, this pattern is different than anything else that you see. And then Sunday, it seems that people behave like a Saturday, the Sunday before, just because probably you have a...
They didn't have to work the day.
Exactly, because you have a holiday day after, you only have to go shooting. But anyways, we did this analysis for 365 days for a full year, and we ended up with 6 MFD clusters. And interestingly, each of these clusters was associated with a different traffic pattern. Now, this is the same map of Zurich 6 times. And on top of the map, we have overlaid a contour plot of traffic congestion or density. The darker colors represent more congestion at the peak period of the MFD. And what you can see is that each of the clusters before is associated with a different traffic pattern in the city and a different congestion pattern. Now, this is good because we see the MFDs are reproducible, not to the extent that people think that it's completely invariant, but still they're reproducible. In fact, you can actually, we did this for a couple of cities, and in all cases, we saw that you can reduce the 365 days into 6, 5, 7 representative MFDs, which is great. But also, now we know that, we prove actually, that if we can monitor only a few streets, very, very few streets, but that give us insights from very early in the morning into this sort of pattern, so into the demand pattern, we can then determine the sort of MFD and with the temporal aspects of that MFD, meaning how congestion is going to propagate or how the system will evolve over time that day, given that demand. And with that, we can be more proactive in developing control strategies to sort of address the demand before the system becomes congested. Now, remember, what we're trying to do is avoid that the system goes over the critical point, go to the congested side. The issue is that the critical point is different for different cities, and that makes it more complicated. In fact, it's different for different regions within the same city. So again, here is a map of Zurich, and here we have two regions, city center and Wiedeken. Wiedeken is just the name of that. And you can see, because of the scale, these are relatively small regions, very small, right? This is 1 kilometer, this distance, so very small regions, yet the MFDs look very different. Now, one interesting fact, I guess, here is you don't see much of congestion in the center, but you do see it in Wiedeken, which is not the city center. Now, the explanation for this is very simple. In 2007, Zurich implemented a perimeter control scheme. 2007 is the same year that D'Aganzo was describing or proposing the MFD, which will be very useful for perimeter control schemes. That year, people in Zurich, without knowing anything about the MFD, they deploy a perimeter control scheme that's not based on the MFD, but still, does it work? I mean, it works. You can see here, and it's still in operation until today. But anyways, other than that, if you look at the capacity, it's different. Now, why is that different? Why? Well, we know that the holidays are the same here and here. When it's Saturday in both places. The demand, so meaning the demand patterns are sort of the same in both places. We also know that the control logic for the traffic lights is the same. It's a single traffic light program they have there. And yes, you have more of a perimeter control here, but other than that, the control logic is the same. So we set out to try to understand what drives those differences. And the differences mostly come from the layout of the network, from the topology of the network. So we decided to study which aspects of the topology of the network influence the critical points, so then we could understand what capacity, traffic capacity, we could expect out of networks based on the layout of those networks. Now, to do that, we collected data from 47 cities worldwide. Most of them are in Europe because that's where we were at the time, and some in the US and some in Asia, but most of them in Europe. Now, another side note, because I want to encourage you to use this data, we actually published this data, made it public. So you can get it there, UTD 19. People typically don't remember the initials UTD. It's urban traffic data. 19 because that was the year when we made it public. So urban traffic data 19. And this is the largest publicly available traffic data set in the world right now. It has close to 5 billion observations, vehicle observations, coming from over 23,000 detectors. It's not 47 cities because it's 40 cities because 7 cities said no to making their data public. But actually now it's a little more because Hong Kong gave us recently their data, which we added, and we're getting data from new cities that we're adding. Anyways, this was just a side note. Use that data. It's very, it can be used for a range of things. It all comes from loop detectors. These are the sensors that you have underneath the pavement. And we have geolocated every sensor for every city. Now, this might sound weird, but most cities don't have the sensors geolocated on a map. So we actually geolocate every sensor for most of the cities, which don't have it, to the specific link, to the specific lane where they are. And we have, this is the example of London. You can see how heavily instrumented, these are all loop detectors, how heavily instrumented is the city. Zurich is also like that. We have quite a few cities that are highly instrumented, so it's a lot of good data. And then you have data at the link level, which you can use at the link level or the network level, any way you want to. And you get the typical flow density or occupancy. Density, if you want to do a transformation, we have, I think, average car lengths for different cities, but we recommend using occupancy. And one of the things, this is completely on the side, but one of the things that we have noticed is that when we talk about the fundamental diagram, even at the link level, we typically don't worry about the scatter and the noise. We have many models to describe the structure of the line, but not the structure of the noise. We are proving that the structure of a noise is rather important because people assume it's Gaussian. It's not Gaussian, but on top of it, the distribution of noise changes as a function of the occupancy or the density. So anyways, the point is you can use this data for analyzing a lot of stuff at the link or at the network level. So I encourage you to use that. So returning to our initial problem, we had data from these 47 cities, but that led to over 100 MFDs, because remember, in many cities, we had to partition the city because an MFD at the city, one MFD for the whole of London doesn't make sense. London is too big, and there are many different areas that are not really connected, and it's not such a homogeneous network. So we ended up with over 100 MFDs. These are 4 examples, and here I'm naming just the city. This is actually Viedicon, but if I say Viedicon, no one will know where that is. It's in Zurich. So these are just some of the MFDs for those cities. And then I'm not going to go into the details. There was a lot of processing of the data to get here, but we went from the observed MFD, we tried to get the theoretical MFD. In previous work, we had proposed a resampling method that allows to estimate the theoretical MFD, the upper bound, that upper bound of the MFD. So we're not looking at the MFD as a function of the demand, but to that invariable upper bound. So we did that, and after we did that for every single MFD, we estimated the critical point and started investigating which aspects of the network affected that. We had over 100 MFDs to do that. For the networks, we use data from OpenStreetMaps. We gather a lot of data and look at many, many different network features. To make a very long story short, we ended up with 4 features that describe, that are responsible for 90% of the variation on the critical point, So the first feature is network length. Okay, these 4 features, before I start, they're all working together. But it's impossible for me to show that in a single graph with so many dimensions. So for illustration purposes, I will show the influence of each feature on its own, understanding that there is correlation between the way the features work. And I would also do that with a 2-regime function for the MFD, but it's just for visualization purposes, has nothing, I mean, we have the numbers of the influence. This is just to visualize it better. And the 2-regime allows to see the critical point rather nicely. And the average we're using for that 2-regime MFD, the average of the 100 MFDs that we have. But again, this is all visualization purposes. What is important here is the features, the topological features that affect the MFD and how they affect it. So the network length, it's the lane kilometers of road that I have on a given area. So the more kilometers of road I have will be the blue line here per given area, the higher my critical point. That sort of makes sense. The more roads I have, the higher the capacity. That being said, and this is not, you cannot see it on this graph, is there are diminishing returns. Meaning the first additional mile of road will get you much more than the 10th additional mile of road that you have. In other words, it's more of what we know. We cannot continue paving. The answer is not to continue paving our cities. Yes, you need to provide some basic infrastructure, and then the more infrastructure you provide at the beginning, the higher your capacity. But after a certain point, additional roads won't get you any additional capacity. And then we know also the issues with induced demand, etc., which are just an additional reason why to continue paving our cities is not the answer. Then we have average centrality. I just put average centrality because the whole name is average between a centrality. And this is a typical metric from network science. And it just tells you of how much you concentrate trips on a given street. Sort of a proxy for the opposite of redundancy on a network. Redundancy on a network means how many options do I have to go from A to B. So on a grid network, for example, you have a lot of redundancy because you can go this way, from here to here, you can go this way, you can go this way, you can go this way. And all of those options give you more or less the same travel times, right? So when you have very high between a centrality, in this case will be a green line, you have low redundancy, meaning you tend to concentrate your trips on a specific streets. Then your capacity is lower, which makes sense, right? Because you're using the whole network less efficiently. Rather than using all the streets, you're sort of concentrating trips. Then we have intersection density. The name is self-explanatory. The higher the intersection density, meaning the more intersections I have per kilometer on a given space, in this case will be the green line, the lower your critical point, yes. So you can think of these two metrics, average between a centrality and intersection density, as the trade-off between car traffic and non-motorized traffic. The higher the average between a centrality and the higher the intersection density, the worse it is for cars. But actually, the better it is for non-motorized traffic, pedestrians, bicycles. When you tend to concentrate all cars in specific roads, that means that the rest of the network is free or more free or freer, I don't know, for people to walk, for kids to play, for people to ride bikes, etc. Similarly, the closer you have the intersections, the easier it is for people to cross the street, etc. Now, the worse it is for cars, short blocks, when you have the intersections too close to each other, first, you're always stopping in your car, which lowers the average throughput of the network. But also, when you have short blocks, the queues spill back easier, and that's damaging for cars. On the other hand, it's easier for pedestrians to cross. Then the fourth metric here, the fourth variable, is the interactions with public transportation. As I said, these two sort of show the trade-off between cars and non-motorized transport. The last one is the interactions between, or the trade-off between cars and motorized transport, but other forms, public transportation. Now, when we had a single variable for public transportation that had two sort of dimensions, one is the density of the public transport network, and the other one is the frequency. The density means how much coverage you have. It's not the same thing to interact with buses on a single street of the whole network than to interact with buses on every single street of the network, right? Similarly, it's not the same thing to interact with a bus that comes every 2 hours that interact with buses every 5 minutes. So here, for illustration purposes, we're only talking about bus headway. So the shorter the headway, meaning the higher the frequency, the lower the critical point. Surprise. Now, I want to make sure that this is clear. I'm not advocating for reducing public transport present or making it harder for pedestrians or not. This is not what it is. I'm just pointing out how these network features affect the capacity for cars. If we were in the business, and I think I'm in the business of improving mobility for people, not for vehicles, I would try to put as much public transport as I can, because public transport is way more efficient in the sense that it moves more people in a smaller amount of space, right? So I'm not advocating for less public transport or anything. I'm just pointing out that the interactions with public transport affect the capacity of a network in terms of cars. So that's good. It tells us, okay, you can design this network with these features, or given the features of this network, you can expect this capacity, but it's not enough because it doesn't tell us how the system becomes congested. How do you go from the uncongested state to the congested state? How does that happen? And we know it's not a trivial answer because congestion just doesn't happen like this. Oh, the whole network became congested. It's not like that. It's a more complex process. Typically, you start with one link that becomes congested. Then with time, the congestion from that link grows or spills into other links, and then another pocket of congestion appears somewhere else on the network. And then these pockets of congestion continue growing and new pockets of congestion start appearing in the network. With time, the pockets of congestion sort of connect to each other or they merge, and then you have the whole network becomes congested. Now, another ways of visualizing this is with this grid where the white squares represent the uncongested links and the red squares represent the congested links. And then I have more and more congested links that are connected to each other, that are adjacent to each other, right? Now, why am I changing the visualization? Because this type of visualization allows to use a concept from physics called percolation, in particular site percolation, which is a type of percolation, to analyze the propagation of traffic congestion. So let's think of this surface now, this grid, as a solid surface where I start poking holes. So the white thing is a solid surface and the red squares are holes that I have poked into that surface. So this P tells you the fraction of squares that are red, that are holes in the surface. 20%, 35, 60, 80%. Percolation describes the process that if I were to drop water or liquid on top of this surface, the likelihood that that liquid will find a connected path all the way to the bottom and it can go through. That's when percolation happens. So in this case, this grid is 20 by 20. If you think about it, and percolation is measured as the likelihood of this happening depending on P. Now, this grid is 20 by 20. So in theory, with 20 red squares only, if I put them on a vertical line, I could have percolation, right? Like if I put all 20 squares like these red squares, I could drop water and the water could go down. However, if I move any of those squares to the right or to the left, then water couldn't go through. In fact, if you think about it, putting 20 red squares like that is a single realization of many possible ways of dropping 20 red squares on that grid, right? So the likelihood of that realization in particular is very small. In fact, as I increase the size of my grid, the likelihood of any specific realization becomes smaller and smaller. Physicists have looked into the analytical formulation for the likelihood of percolation for infinitely large grids. So that's the probability of percolation for an infinitely large grid as a function of the fraction of red squares, right? And this is how it looks like. It's a non-continuous function. It's close to 0 all the way until it reaches a critical point, in this case, 59%. And then it jumps dramatically, and then it reaches 1 closely after. Now, percolation has other features as well, and I'm going to introduce this feature so then the whole thing makes sense. If we were to measure the number of clusters, and by cluster, I mean either one or more red squares that are connected to each other, adjacent to each other. If I were to measure the number of clusters, it grows until a certain point, and then it drops. Why would it drop if I continue increasing the number of red squares? Does it make sense that the number of clusters drops, even if I'm increasing the number of red squares? Well, it drops because the clusters start merging with each other. So in the extreme, when I have 100% red squares, I have a single cluster. It's one big red area, right? Okay, so this peaks and then drops. Similarly, if I were to track the size of the largest cluster, it's called G because it's giant component. It's the size of the largest cluster. Looks like this. It grows slowly at the beginning, and then around the same time that the yellow line peaks, that the number of clusters peaks, it starts growing fast. Now, Why would that happen? It happens because initially the largest component grows by adding one red square here, one red square there, one red square here. But once the clusters start to merge, the largest cluster starts adding other clusters to itself. So now it adds 10 red squares at once, 15 red squares at once, 20 red squares at once. And this is why the fast growth. Now, these two things happen before percolation. So this peak, which coincides with this drastic growth, change of slope, happened before percolation. So they're considered a precursor for percolation. Now, we were looking into this and we wanted to understand whether there was any similarity between the dynamics of percolations and the dynamics of traffic as those described by the MFD that we discussed before. Now, what happens is that in the MFD, I'm measuring flow as a function of density, and here I'm measuring everything as a function of P. But what we really care is whether there was any temporal relation or correlation between these two things. So we measure everything in terms of T, in terms of time. Now, how do we do this? Well, we run a lot of large-scale simulations. We label the congested links. We identify the clusters, and then we track all the different metrics. I'm going to explain little by little each of these things. So we had to create large-scale traffic simulations. And for those, we did it for 5 cities. And we used demands, calibrated demands from call data records, from cell phone usage. The demands have been derived in a previous paper by one of our co-authors, so nothing to worry about that. Like, we didn't have to worry about that. That was done already. And we had the 4 to 11 a.m. morning peak. Again, we got all the data for the actual networks from OpenStreetMaps, and that gave us all the different types of road classes and the number of lanes, the speed limits, the traffic signals, the type of priorities at all intersections, etc. And then we developed a sumo mesoscopic model that had periodic stochastic rerouting. What do I mean by this? Rerouting is the possibility that you reroute once you're on your way, right? So you get into a network, but as any driver would do, if suddenly there's a huge queue in front of you, you might reassess what is the best route to get from where you are to your destination. So you might actually turn right there or no. So we did this periodically, meaning all drivers did it periodically, but we say it's stochastic because not all drivers had perfect information, which means that some of them, when they rerouted, they didn't take the best route, or some of them didn't take any detour at all because they didn't have perfect information when doing that. Anyways, we did it for 5 cities, 3 in the US, Los Angeles, Boston, and San Francisco, and then Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and Lisbon in Portugal. And this is just to give you an idea of the level of detail of the simulation. So this is just 2 screenshots of highway interchange here on the left and a normal intersection on the right. And you can see the detail of the simulation for both of them. You know, it was a very detailed simulation. This is just to give you a flavor of the sort of simulation that we got. This is only 1% of the trips between 9 and 10 a.m. in Los Angeles. Only 1%, so you can actually see it. Otherwise, it's just all colored and you don't see anything. But that gives you an idea of what the whole simulation looked like. We calibrated the travel times using, with a Google API, we extracted 10,000 random OD pairs or trips, and using the actual travel departure time for trips that were longer than 1 kilometer to make sure that there was no bias on very short trips. We calibrated the travel times, and you can see it's fairly good. In any case, we were not trying to reproduce a very specific scenario for those cities. We were trying to reproduce realistic conditions, traffic conditions. That was our intent. So once we did that, we labeled the congested links. How do we label every link at each time step? We had a lot of data from the simulation. So automatically for every link, we derive the fundamental diagram that we described at the beginning. Then we used 2 different metrics to actually decide whether the link was congested or not. One was the speed index and the other one was the critical density. And for every time step, we said for each link, based on the fundamental diagram of that individual link, this link is congested or it's not. And this is, again, the map of LA showing the speed index for an exaggerated demand. This is not the real demand. This is something exaggerated for you to see how the speed index changes throughout the network. Again, this is not the real demand. This is just something so that the colors can pop up. And then once we had for every time step, every link defined as congested or uncongested, then we identified the congested clusters. A cluster was one or more links adjacent to each other that were congested, according to our definition of congestion. And this, for example, is a map of Rio de Janeiro, and the different colors represent different congested clusters. So at the beginning, you see you have a lot of different colors. With time, some colors start becoming more prevalent than others because those congested clusters start growing and absorbing the other ones. And towards the end, you see that the whole city becomes a single congested cluster. Yeah. And while we did that for all cities, we track a bunch of traffic performance indicators and a lot of percolation metrics. The one I mentioned and many others that allow us to prove that percolation exists or not. Back to the same example of Rio. Here, for example, here, for instance, we have the number of congested clusters, and here we have the vehicle flow. Again, these are just two examples of metrics that we were collecting on the traffic side and on the percolation side. So before I show you the results, I'm gonna sort of describe them using these graphs because that's easier to see. Remember, we wanted to understand whether there was any relation between the dynamics of percolations and of the percolation process and the dynamics of traffic as described by the MFD. So the first thing we observed was that the peak on the number of clusters coincided with the peak to the critical point of the fundamental of the MFD. Now, I'm currently doing some other research with different definitions for congestion, saying, because our definition of congestion was the definition that agrees with traffic flow theory that says if you're on the left side of the diagram and if you're on the right side of the diagram, you're congested or not. Now we're changing that to see, well, what happens if I use a different definition? It's not necessarily of congestion, it's a definition for clustering. If I say, as soon as you have 10% of the density of the total density, jam density, you belong to another cluster, etc. And that moves this point. But if you do it with the actual definition of congestion, the point coincides with the capacity of the MFD. This is not what we were expecting, but it actually makes sense. Because what happens before this point, as I add density to the network, as I add more cars to the network, I have many clusters, many pockets of congestion, but still they're separated. Right? I have many of them, but they're separated, which means that in between them, I have free flow conditions. Otherwise, it would be congested also in between. And that allows drivers to take detours between those pockets of congestion. So even though I keep adding drivers or vehicles to the network, I can maintain a relatively very high flow in the network because cars can take small detours and bypass the congested areas. However, once the clusters start to merge here, that free flow space between clusters disappears and the ability of drivers to take the tours sort of disappears. So as I add more drivers, they get trapped into congestion and there's no way for them to avoid it, right? So the flow starts going down. So that makes sense. That also coincided with the sudden increase in the slope or the size of the largest component, the largest cluster. And what happens with percolation? We know percolation happens after. It actually should happen somewhere on the right side. But then you might ask, well, how do you measure percolation? Because I cannot drop water in a network and see how it comes out on the other side. Well, there are many other metrics to measure percolation that I didn't introduce before, but one of them is the size of the second largest component. Is SG for second giant component. And if we measure the size of the second largest component, it follows a similar behavior to the largest component. Initially grows slowly by adding individual red squares. But with time, it starts, when the clusters start merging, the second largest component starts growing faster because it starts also absorbing other clusters. Now, in contrast with the largest component, which continues to grow, at some point here, the second largest component drops in size. Why? And that coincides. That's percolation, or coincides with percolation. Why does it drop in size? If you go back to the image of Rio that I show you, it's because the largest component absorbs the second largest component and everything becomes congested. That's when percolation happens. There are other ways to actually corroborating or confirming that percolation exists, like looking at the cumulative distribution of sizes of all congestion pockets when congestion clusters when percolation happens, etc. I won't go into that, but I have the details in some backup slide if you want to see it. So anyways, percolation did happen. The question might be, however, what does that mean in terms of traffic? What does it mean for percolation to happen in terms of traffic? We know in physics, percolation is a non-reversible process, meaning once the system percolates, once the water goes through, it cannot unpercolate, it cannot not go through, right? Now, traffic is not that way because we know everything is reversible. I mean, we just talk about the reproducibility of the MFD at the beginning. For it to be reproducible means that the next day it's going to do the same thing that it did this morning, which means that the system resets itself. In traffic, everything resets, the conditions reset themselves because the demand disappears or everyone goes to sleep at some point and the system empties and then you go back, you start. So what exactly does it mean to have percolation in traffic? This is an open question, but our assumption right now is that, well, what we know about traffic, is that around capacity, the system is very unstable. That we know, we have always known. So you can be there for a while, you can linger around capacity for a while, or sometimes something triggers a quick propagation of congestion. Our assumption is that it might have to do whether you reach a point with the fact of whether you reach a point or not. If you reach a point, then it seems like everything collapses rather quickly. In fact, when you go back, you might have hysteresis loops, etc. I don't know if you're familiar with hysteresis loop, but you go back like this. Again, this is work in progress. I don't have any proof of that yet. So that might be what percolation means. But as I said, this is work in progress. Now, these are the results for Rio. I'm going to start with a single city because it's easier. The colors are exactly the same as I showed you before. So the pink line describes the flow as observed by the MFD, and it's given on the right axis. The yellow line represents the number of clusters and is given by 10% of the left axis. And the blue line corresponds to the size of the largest component. And by size, I mean the number of links that are included in the largest component is given by the left axis. So the first thing to notice is that the peak in the number of clusters coincides with the peak in flow, which coincides with a sudden growth in the size of the largest component or the largest cluster. And this is marked with a vertical line. We don't have the size of the second largest component in this graph because it would require another axis, and it's just impossible. We try, and it's impossible to see. It becomes too complicated. But what we did was mark the drop in the size of the largest component with this dashed line. And as you see, it happens later. Now, what does this time gap means? How can it be avoided or how can it be extended? That's something that we're trying to answer. The results are exactly the same for the other 4 cities. Or let me be more clear. For San Francisco and Los Angeles, that show percolation. Fortunately, Lisbon and Boston did not percolate. But because the demand that we loaded the network with was not enough for the system to actually become overly congested. That being said, the rest of all the fissures behave in the same way as we were expecting until the point that we observed, even though there was no percolation. So, percolation seems to define or to describe how traffic congestion propagates, but there's still a few questions that we need to answer about what that means. So just to recap, with that I'm finishing the presentation, but I just want to recap the main things that we have seen today. The MFD is reproducible, but not to the extent that many people think, because you still have variations in network performance and it's mostly related to the demand. Therefore, topology factors that affect this 90% or that justify or describe 90% of the variation in the capacity of cities. We have seen how percolation can describe the process of the propagation of traffic congestion, but we're still wondering about the percolation lag, the time between when the clusters peak, the number of clusters peak, and percolation actually happen. What does that mean? How can we extend it or completely avoid the percolation part? And what does percolation exactly mean for a traffic system? Is it true that you get a hysteric behavior afterwards, etc.? So these are open questions that we have right now. So with that, I finish the presentation, and I think we have like 13 minutes or 10 minutes, 10 minutes for questions. So I'm happy to answer any questions now. I don't know if there's anyone online. No? Thank you. Do you have questions? Do you have questions?
I have a question.
Okay, sure.
We
start with this.
For the informative presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, and my question is, for the city you choose to do the simulation is Boston, San Francisco, and the other two. Yeah. Why you choose these 4 cities?
We chose those 5 cities because those were the cities where we have very cold little records. Demands have been calibrated. We needed origin destination demands at a large scale for a long period of time. And those were the 5 cities that were accessible to us at the time. Because for all the other data that I said is traffic data, but we don't have demand data. We have only observations from traffic. So we needed 5 cities where we had demand data.
So does the city, like the city size, the population density, or the characteristic affect your simulation result?
No, we didn't look into any of those factors that are affecting. Here, for those 5 cities, we were just looking whether percolation can actually explain traffic, the propagation of traffic congestion or not, and it did. We did not explore how those cities or the topology or the population of those cities influence the demand of those cities or the MFD per se. We didn't look into that.
Questions here. So earlier you were talking about some of the efficiencies that we can use by defining just the links, right? And how it can really define the whole network. So how do we use, I guess, how do we identify the points within the networks that we really should measure to actually define those links?
Yes. So what we did in that paper we did it for 2 cities. We investigated a bunch of links, and it ended up being the links that provide access to the city for the demand, because it was on the, give me a second. So for this, we're getting there. These different patterns were just the result of different demands, right? And any link that allows to understand the sort of demand that you were going to get would potentially give us insights into these patterns. Now, those links are not this. I don't know if they say it online, but those are not random links. They're typically entries to the city. So, and which is actually what the city of Zurich does. They look into entries to the city, the main entrances, the main gates to the city.
So they can limit it.
Exactly, and so by understanding the main entrances to a city, we could get a very good picture of the demand that we were. Now, different cities have different demand patterns, right? So in some of them, I'm saying entry to a city because the demand is coming from outside. But if you have the demand coming from inside the city, you probably have links that are very internal. But these are some links that give you quick insights into how the demand is going to look like. Yes.
So the last part of your study is try to find another way of defining congestion status, right? And I know it's still ongoing process, but when you think of doing that, have you thought about the next step? If you can prove that this is new way of defining the congestion, then how would that benefit the development of countermeasure strategies?
There's multiple things, but one is we have always tried in traffic to be on the left side of capacity. And if you look at perimeter control schemes, etc., they tend to be rather the ones that people propose, because perimeter control scheme is very popular, but I only know of Zurich implementing it, and they're doing it not based on the MFA. But anyways, but if you look at most of the proposals are sort of conservative in a way, because you want to remain to the left side of that, which then means that you're on the lower side of the capacity. Now we're trying to say, what we're seeing is that you can actually hang out around the capacity point, which is a less conservative control of traffic, as long as you don't cross the percolation point. And those differences can be meaningful in terms of how many cars the city can we let into the city, etc. Might also mean that rather than avoiding all traffic congestion, we just need to focus on avoiding the percolation process itself, which might be just the merge of the largest two clusters. I don't know, this is a speculation, but potentially we could just focus on trying to avoid that these two large clusters merge at the end, which means just focus on very specific area, right? Because as long as you avoid that, the whole system doesn't become congested. So
It sounds so simple though, like the clusters don't move around. Like it's not like a
Yeah.
variable that's changing. The whole time.
Exactly. So there's repetition, there's reproducibility into some of them. Like we see here, this is, I don't know if this corresponds to Wednesday or Thursday, I don't remember, but basically if this corresponds to Wednesday, most Wednesdays look the same way, right? So there might be a lot of implications for control purposes.
We talk about this because we know we could find the similar days by using some of these methods. Now the question would be, if it really goes to the implementation of the management strategies, basically you need to predict what this day is. Does it fall into any of these clusters? So would that be easily done, or?
So this is what we did for in this study. Actually, we looked at a couple of cities, and we looked into picking information from different links, and then we ended up with which links, with a subset of links, and we could tell from 7 a.m. I think those were the results on the paper. From 7 a.m., we could tell you more or less what the MFD was going to look like for the day, and for the morning peak. This was only focusing on the morning peak. So from 6 something to 7 a.m., we could tell you how it was going to look like based on the initial demand patterns that we were observing, right? And that would allow us to be more proactive because right now the way it works is like we wait for congestion to happen to say, okay, let's do something, right? But if we know exactly how congestion is going to propagate that day, we could do something ahead of time. And by tying the congestion patterns to the MFD, and then to some links that could tell us how this is going to look like, we could tell you that our MFD clusters don't tell you only the shape, but they tell you we were looking at the temporal aspect of it. At what point at what time in the day am I reaching the different traffic states?
So basically, with this prediction capability, you could actually use simulation to demonstrate the benefits of the traffic management strategies, right? Because you're saying, okay, if I can predict which pattern, and given this pattern, I know which specific locations or intersections or parts I need to do some adaptive traffic control, right?
Yeah, sure. The idea is the use of this will be mostly for traffic control. I'm showing now all the theory behind how we get to this, but the ultimate use of everything that I have shown today is for traffic control. Thank you.
Always keep my attention the whole time, Monica. Not all the speakers do.
Thank you.
Look at you.
Thank you very much. That's extremely nice of you. I don't know if there are any questions online, or if am I supposed to see them? Oh no. Okay. Well, thank you to the people online, and thank you all for.
We want to thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Set up the foundation prediction
Yeah.
and how to create the new strategies.
Yeah, I think it's important. So there's a lot of data that is being generated and collected nowadays. I don't think we need to substitute completely all the fundamental knowledge that we have acquired over the years in favor of data, but we should totally integrate these two areas of research, data science and the fundamentals that we know from traffic.
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to do here.
I think this raises active faded out.
Yeah.
And it's talked about, but I think this is a perfect way to come to more like a modern style
Of adaptive control, yes, yes, because adaptive control before had limited, very limited data.
Limited, only
Yeah.
with a corridor and
Yeah,
a
yeah.
narrow street,
Yes.
et cetera. Also has no so significant or powerful
Diction.
predictive.
Exactly. Because it's easier maybe to predict at an aggregate scale than to predict what's happening at a very detailed level, right? And it seems that at an aggregate scale, things are reproducible to a certain extent, et cetera, so we can actually understand them better. Okay, thank you again, everyone.
Yeah, by the way, this presentation is recorded, and we're gonna put on our social media if it's okay with you.
Sure.
And, you know,
Sure.
we have communication officers here. Yeah, so I think this is very, very important. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much, everyone.